Everybody in Humanities 107 checking in again. Not checking in. I don't talking to you once again. There we go. That's a term that works. By the way, my dog is yelling at me from the other side of the room, so my apologies. Do you hear that weird little moan that she's doing over there? Zoe, you're interrupting. Uh anyway, so we're continuing with our discussion of American cinema, the culture of American cinema. I think these couple of weeks are called here. And what I want to turn to this week, we had discussed the mythic structure of many American movies, maybe most American movies last week. We had thought about maybe applying that to Sorry to Bother You, and I had also brought up that idea from the thematic paradigm of the official hero and the outlaw hero. And that right there in the thematic paradigm is actually something that I think is interesting to carry over with us a little bit. That's a concept that I think can transfer, because what I want to delve into this week and what I hope to hear from you on the discussion boards is some insight into the most prominent myths in American culture right now, which are the science fiction and superhero movies that have predominated American movies and television for the past 40 years, I would say, maybe longer. Um, and I actually think that just that topic generally, the fact that our most popular stories have tended to be action and adventure movies that are either science fiction, therefore set in some, maybe in the future, maybe as Star Wars is set in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago. But generally not of this earth, not of a recognizable reality, or they are superhero stories, action adventure stories, once again, about people who look and act relatively normal, but who have extraordinary superhuman skill sets. There's been a ton of movies in both of these veins in the past couple of decades, both of which remain tremendously popular in the past couple of decades as well. I think if you're looking for sort of a starting point for either of those traditions, the release of the original Star Wars back in 1977, I think, is when modern science fiction is not born per se, but when it breaks through and becomes a dominating force in initially in what you might call geek culture, but eventually becoming a dominant force in American popular culture generally. There's an interesting sort of story there about how the geeks have inherited the earth since the 1970s and 1980s, much to their surprise, one presumes. But Star Wars and related science fiction have certainly been immensely popular, as you can tell with just the crazy numbers that every Star Wars movie brings in. And I think you can also look back a couple of decades to see the rise of superhero movies. There's two in particular that stand out to me. There is the release of the original Batman movie in 1989, directed by Tim Burton and starring Michael Keaton as Batman and Jack Nicholson as the Joker. I think that is really the birth, in many ways, of modern superhero cinema. There are Superman movies made back in the 70s and 80s, but they don't quite fit in the same way. They just have maybe the special effects technology wasn't there. It's not that they're bad movies. The theme music for the Superman movies is iconic, but it's not that they weren't popular. But I think if you're looking at like how modern superhero movies are made and designed, 1989's Batman is really the starting point. And if you're looking for how superhero movies broke through into the world we have today, where there are just endless franchises of superhero movies and then sequels and then spin-offs and then overarching get-togethers, I think you would go back to 2002's Spider-Man, which I was just rewatching last week. Not all of, but a little bit of it. That was the first movie to make $100 million in the weekend that it was released. $100 million used to be, if you made that over the whole run of a movie, like months, that was a tremendous hit. Spider-Man made $100 million in 3 days. The first 3 days it was released back in May 2002. I think that's when really Hollywood realized just how much people liked these stories and how much money was made off of hyping them up making sequels, making franchises, stuff like that. And it is worth noting, if you include animated films, we have had 4 different Spider-Man movie franchises since 2002 in the past 18 years, which is truly remarkable. I mean, how many different Batmans have we had since 1989? Michael Keaton, Val Kilmer, George Clooney, Christian Bale, Ben Affleck, Robert Pattinson. So yeah, we're on to six Batmen. That would make my son very happy. Um, so we've got this long-standing tradition, very popular fantasy sci-fi like Star Wars, and very popular superhero action adventure like Batman, Spider-Man, The Avengers, etc. What I want us to think about with this stuff in our discussion this week and in your own minds is why we respond to these stories. Why is it that stories of fantasy resonate with us so much? I mentioned Star Wars. Comic books. You can also roll in stuff like Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings. Those are more like the fairy tale version of fantasy, high fantasy, it's sometimes called, but that could certainly be rolled in here as well. Game of Thrones could be part of this discussion as well. That one is a much more adult in its content and its seriousness, but I think that's part of the equation here to a large degree too. I think there is an interesting case to be made about why these stories resonate with us, why Americans tend to love these fantasies. And it's articulated pretty well in one of the essays for this week, which is Why the West Loves Sci-Fi and Fantasy. That article was written, I think, back 2013 or something like that. And it delves into the fact that Hollywood fantasies, comic books, science fiction, high fantasy with wizards and stuff like that, tend to do pretty well in countries that are pretty similar to the United States. But there is one major country where those movies don't really make any money at all, and that's India. And the South Asian movie market. Now, there's a lot of factors at play there, but the author makes an interesting case that there is essentially a cultural difference between South Asian audiences, primarily in India, but also in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and Western audiences, you might say, in the United States and Europe, but also in very westernized Asian countries like Japan and Korea. And essentially, the argument goes that Western society, or societies influenced heavily by the West, are living in the aftermath of the Age of Enlightenment back in the 1700s, where you had this dramatic cultural conflict between tradition and new science and new philosophy. And essentially, in the West, science and rationalism won. For things to be acceptable, they have to be explainable. You can't rely on myths, so to speak, in order to do a thing. That's probably a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think it's a fairly compelling one. We are a very rational, demystified, as that essay says, society. We know that we can measure the whole world, and those measurements can help us control the world. We're dealing with that right now. The reason that I'm talking to you through this is because of science, and also because the science of epidemics said that if we were meeting in the class, that some of you would get sick, some of you might even be dramatically sick, and you would only be one part of a huge wave of people who would get deeply sick. That is a scientific, rational explanation for social distancing. And that's not to say that social distancing is not being followed in India, or that India is not rational or anything like that. Not the case here. But instead, there's this interesting argument that Indian society, Indian culture, never got rebuilt along those deeply rational lines. And God, I hope I'm not coming off as condescending in kind of paraphrasing this. But essentially, the idea is that South Asian cinema doesn't respond to science fiction and fantasy because their culture doesn't respond to it in the same way. We live in a demystified world where everything is rational and measurable, and so fantasy provides something that is beyond our reality. You go to see superhero movies because you know that there's no actual superheroes, and so you indulge in the fantasy. You go to see Star Wars because you know that there's no intergalactic empire, there's no rebel alliance, and so it provides this larger than life fantasy for your emotions and your ideas to run wild in. I think that's pretty compelling, and I think it's interesting to think that there are places where those same fantasies are not necessary. Where in a lot of South Asian cinema, in Bollywood, as it's called, the drama comes from personal relationships, family conflicts, and it does involve levels of fantasy, but usually not the sort of like alternate realities that you see in American cinema. And that's sort of fascinating. And I do think that's a thing worth asking. Why do we need fantasies in American life? What is it about our cold, bureaucratic, rational society that makes people want to break the chain, as it were, and do things that are impossible in the culture that we have? Obviously, that's a big need in American culture in a lot of ways, and I think these movies, part of the reason they're so popular is they let us indulge them to a large degree. Now, the other thing I wanted to think about in terms of why we respond to these movies has to do with the message of the movies themselves, the themes that they present. And there's actually two different bits in my head that I'll be articulating here. One of them is another essay in the book. I didn't make it an assigned reading, but I do think it's a good reading. It's titled What We Talk About When We Talk About Batman and Superman. That I think is a fascinating look at conflicting ideologies, one of our old familiar ideas in class. Superman and Batman, just saying it in this room, I expected to hear my son start screaming Batman. They are extremely well-known characters. They've both been around since basically the exact same moment, 1939. Created by the same company, DC Comics, and released by the same movie studios, Warner Brothers. And yet these are superheroes. They're both good guys, but they're not good guys in the same way. Superman is truth, justice, and the American way. He is an alien coming to us from planet Krypton, and that gives him superhuman abilities. He is capable of physical feats of strength and power that essentially make him a living god in the superhero stories, in Superman stories specifically. My favorite example of that, by the way, is I guess you'd call it a graphic novel. It's called Superman for All Seasons. I think it's beautiful. I read it back in college. But he is the good guy. He is the ideal. Literally, one of his most famous things is he fights for truth, justice, and the American way. And I've always found that kind of resonant, especially the fact that he is an alien. He's an immigrant, and yet he embodies these ideals of American society and of, defeating evil, but doing it in a way where you don't lose your own soul. And where you live up to the dreams and ideals of a democratic, egalitarian society. He puts a sunny face on fighting evil. Batman, by contrast, is a figure of darkness. He is, an orphan, a billionaire who uses his fortune to train himself, acquire weaponry, and fight evil and crime through terror. It's not too big of a jump to say that Batman terrorizes criminals. That's his power, and that is an entirely different approach to fighting crime, to doing good. Batman doesn't see people as inherently good. If you trust them, he sees them as just waiting to be bad, and you need to be prepared and meet them on that level. You have to hold yourself to your own moral code, but that is a rigorously difficult thing to do, and that is also something that leaves you a bit of an emotional shell. Bruce Wayne, not great at parties, bit of a psychopath, maybe sociopath. I don't know. I'm not a psychopath. You get the idea. Whereas Clark Kent, straight as narrow. There's a little conflict between the real person and the superhero, whereas Bruce Wayne and Batman there's some shit going on there. And so it's fascinating that these are from the same people, but they represent such distinct ways of approaching life. And I think it's really fascinating, this essay lays it out, that in the 40s, the 50s, even through a lot of the 60s, Superman was the more popular character in a time where American society was confident, where it was swaggering, and was maybe a little more socially and politically unified. But ever since the 1980s, Batman has been by far the more popular character. Batman movies have done much, much better at the box office. Batman comics and anything is far more resonant. And I think that's kind of fascinating. Why is it that American society today sees darkness as the response? Why do we need a figure like Batman, who a friend of mine was very upset. Two of my friends had an argument once about whether or not Batman was a fascist, and I just kind of sat on the sidelines and went, "I'm just amused to see you argue." But Batman is a figure who doesn't kill, and that's about as far as it goes when it comes to doing good. He will fight crime, but he will not hesitate to do it in a dark way, and that feels appropriate, accurate. I don't know. I'll look forward to your comments there. Why is it that right now we feel like Batman is the hero for these times and not Superman? Would you like for us to be in a Superman reality? Might be nice. I don't know. The other sort of thematic ideological conflict I wanted to think about was within Star Wars, the conflict between the Empire and the Rebel Alliance. In the older films, the Jedi and the Sith in the prequels, which are hot garbage, and then the conflict between the First Order and the Resistance, I guess, in these most recent films. I haven't seen Rise of the Skywalker. I don't know if I ever will, but whatever. I know what happens. Hot garbage. But I want to think about this for a little bit. The Star Wars films present this as basically a conflict of good versus evil on a very simple, almost too simple level. But they also tend to present it as conflict between sort of selfishness and selflessness, between power and empathy. There's a lot of different elements between the good side, the light side, and the dark side of the Force. Just I, those sorts of dichotomies in the morality of movies always drives me a little bit crazy. Life is a lot more complicated than dark or light. We all live in gray, somewhere in the middle, and yet I think we crave that simplicity. We want to know that we are good or bad, perhaps, as the case may be. But interestingly, I posted a link to another video essay by Lindsay Ellis, who did that Woke Disney video that we watched in class back in the before time. Check it out. It's called The Ideology of the First Order. That is the essentially Empire replacement in the more recent films. What she really delves into there is how the villains in Star Wars, the Sith, the Empire, the First Order, they have always leaned heavily on the imagery of Nazi Germany. The costumes, the direction, all of it is lifted almost entirely from Nazi propaganda footage, especially a very famous film called Triumph of the Will, which is world famous. The Ellis video talks about this. When you think of Nazi Germany, you don't think of the actual imagery of Nazi Germany, what it was like to be in Germany in the Nazi period, the 12-year Reich. You think of the propaganda images that the Nazis created for themselves in films like Triumph of the Will. That became so ingrained as just what fascism looked like that when they made Star Wars in 1977, 30 odd years after the end of World War II, George Lucas and his collaborators just kind of lifted that imagery from Triumph of the Will and made the Empire and the Sith look like Nazis, space Nazis, essentially. Now, interestingly, in all of the Star Wars movies, you rarely get an articulation of what it is that the Sith or the Empire or the First Order want. What is the ideology that they are fighting for? Obviously, that was a very big part of Nazism. It was very clear, racial purity and the triumph of the German people was the goal of Nazism, which led to the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. What is it? Fascism relies on scapegoating. It relies on saying that this group is not of us. They're not one of the people, and we need to cast them out. And that's kind of the call to heroism, is you need to fight for your people and sacrifice yourself in a noble, heroic death. Lindsay Ellis delves into all of this. We never see what it is that the Sith or the First Order are scapegoating, who they see as the outsiders in galactic society, I guess you'd say. And I think that's really interesting. And I do think it presents an interesting question for us. When we see conflicts like this, good versus evil, dark versus light sides of the force, Batman versus Superman, these sorts of things. Um, I wonder if, to some degree, the ideologies are left vague so that we can fill in the blanks for ourselves. You think of Star Wars films; those are seen by everybody. Everybody has seen Star Wars, including people in the United States who would identify as fascist. Do neo Nazis identify with the Sith? Or on some level, do they see themselves as Jedi? I don't know. This is a good example of one of those concepts we talked about earlier in the semester: over determination. Star Wars potentially means everything to everybody, including making people whose ideologies I find evil and abhorrent to see themselves as heroes. And maybe Disney doesn't really fill in those blanks because that also lets them sell merchandise to everybody, regardless of their personal political or social ideologies and identities. Stuff to think about. I'll see your thoughts and comments in the discussion board. See you next week. Or no, actually, the week after. Next week is spring break. In, anyway.